Howdy, y'all. Welcome back. The Peyseurs are one of the most infamous yet mysterious theorized families of so-called American royalty, or the families which seemingly have such a tight grasp over the sphere of influence in America that backtracking through the company, stocks, and major events in their control will leave even the most seasoned of researchers like myself with their jaw on the floor. Furthermore, we all by this point are familiar with the families like the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds and other major families which, while remaining somewhat reclusive, have still had their exploits detailed in major news outlets. The one family you most likely have never and will never hear about in the mainstream is the Payseur family, who, according to some myth and legend and theories, are the most powerful clan ever to call America home. Today, we will look to separate fact from fiction, entertaining wildly outlandish claims regarding the one American family you simply cannot talk about. To my friend Sam Tripoli over at Tinfoil Hat Podcast, a hilarious comedian but also an avid researcher, he was contacted, he says, by multiple people claiming to be of power, telling him not to talk about the Peyseurs. I've seen other videos which make similar claims, but today I will try to dive into all of this for you. Now, according to the myth, and again, myth, the Peyseurs established their family in America in the 17th century. However, the true mystery comes from the claims of what occurred in the centuries which followed. Now, there have been numerous claims, and again, these are all hypotheses, but they say that the Peyseur family, in this theory, secretly adopted the young French monarch, Louis XVII, after he was smuggled out of France during the French Revolution. And in the 19th century, even more anomalies arise when we begin to compare the narrative regarding Abraham Lincoln to the history of the Peyseurs. Today, I will use established records from the last 400 years, utilizing ancestry data, as well as numerous theories proposed both in recent times and in the 18th and 19th centuries, looking to fully flesh out the idea that the Peyseur family has influenced American history for the last few centuries and continues to today. Again, this video is for entertainment purposes, and these are all just theories, albeit they arrive to us in a time when this information is becoming more available than ever. And I believe there is certainly a reason that videos looking to dive into this history are being suppressed and downvoted and censored online. So I will attempt to peel back the veil, apparently a risky maneuver, and look to share this unbelievable theory with you. Be prepared, the results and the theories are somewhat interesting to say the least. I will begin by addressing a piece of literature entitled, and I quote, U.S. Congressional Record of 1940 regarding British, Israel world government, end quote. This seems to be the same document that is being mimicked in others' attempts to quote-unquote reveal this information. Again, all just a theory, but this appears to be scrubbed from most places online. Right off the bat, this narrative in this little piece of literature is regarding Louis Payseur, who lived from 1850 through 1939. This was indeed a real individual who clearly was very proud of his French heritage, and indeed his name appears on the deeds to multiple companies in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Now here are where the more outlandish claims of the profile of Louis Payseur begin. First, this article claims that Louis Payseur is a descendant of Daniel Payseur, with Daniel, in this theory, being an adopted name for Louis XVII, the deposed child king of France. Looking into the possibility of this, we're told Louis was born in 1795 in the Palace of Versailles in Paris. When his older brother passed in June of 1789, Louis became heir to the throne. For most of his young life, Louis had multiple governesses from all across Europe who came to France to look after him. However, it is also written that it was a mob of mostly women who forced the royal family from Versailles in October of 1789. By 1792, the family was moved to a tower known as the Tower, which was a fortified structure left over from a massive castle that was built as the fort for the Knights Templar. Here at the Tower, Louis was eventually separated from his family and forced to speak out against his mother, Marie Antoinette. After this, Louis refused to speak again. We're told after numerous attempts to free the boy, he was eventually kept in solitude, with no one entering his chambers for up to 6 months. Eventually, he was provided with a new attendant, said to be a Creole man from the New World. Louis apparently refused to speak to anyone but his new attendant. In December of 1794, according to the mainstream narrative, he was visited by 3 French congressmen, but again refused to speak. By March of 1795, he was said to have been appointed a new guard. However, by May, he fell seriously ill. According to this mainstream narrative, his original doctor, P.J. Desault, was brought in, and he said he did not recognize the boy after not seeing him for 7 months. And then, just days after seeing Louis, Dr. Desault passed away. Louis XVII was then said to also pass away just a week later on June 8, 1795. The attending physician who completed the autopsy, Dr. Pelton, claimed the boy passed from something known as King's Evil, a form of tuberculosis, and the prince was buried rather quickly, less than 2 full days later, on June 10, 1795. Since this time period, dozens have come forward claiming to be the escaped heir to the French throne. Tying this back to the main article and the myth or the legend of the Peyseurs that's in question, this claims that Louis, under the assumed name of Daniel Peyseur, married Susanna Reiser or Kaiser in 1814. Susanna was sister to Sarah Reiser or Kaiser, who was married to John Reed of Reed Gold Mines, who was said to have begun the gold rush into the Carolinas. We're told through these avenues, the former boy king of France in this hypothesis eventually ruled over much of the gold trade in the southern United States. He was said to have used his wealth to purchase holdings in multiple banks, factories related to manufacturing railway parts, fledgling canal companies, and steam-powered engines, including plows, now known as the company International Harvester, as well as manufacturer's Colt to produce the first Gatlings, and was said to have invested in the wagon company which would become Cadillac. We're told under this moniker, Daniel Peyseur, he also invested in Eli Whitney, being the secretive driving force to bring the cotton gin to the Carolinas. While we don't find the name Daniel Peyseur mentioned directly, it's of note the cotton gin was first brought to use in the Carolinas. After validation of the patent, the government of South Carolina voted $50,000 for the rights for that state, while North Carolina levied a license tax for 5 years, which about $30,000 was realized from. Diving into these claims further, I was shocked to see that the Colt Company, which began in the North but evidently failed there, actually achieved fame from the Colt Walker, which was created for the Mexican-American War. We're told because Colt was nearly bankrupt at the time, he had to produce the Colt Walker at another family's armory. This armory just so happened to be owned and run by Eli Whitney, the same man who invented the cotton gin and was supposedly being backed by the Peyseurs. Here, Colt was able to achieve worldwide success. Again, these pieces of the Daniel Peyseur narrative are still somewhat fitting together. Now prepare yourself, but the Cadillac Company was founded from the ashes of the Henry Ford Company, Henry Ford's second automobile venture, which he abandoned. We're told in 1902, Ford's financial backers invited to his defunct factories one Henry M. Leland of Leland and Falconer Manufacturing Company. Leland got his start working for leading Swedish manufacturers Brown and Sharp before becoming a lead engineer and precision machinist for the Colt Company. After his work with Colt, Leland was invited to the Henry Ford factories where he convinced the financiers to keep providing automobiles, which would thenceforth be known as Cadillacs. Again, everything about the seemingly ridiculous Daniel Peyseur theory and this narrative seemingly holds up so far. Now, according to this theory, Daniel Peyseur and Susanna had 2 sons, Adam and Jonas. Again, we're taking this all as a farce, but still looking to find any truth that we can. We're told Adam lost his life at a young age, leaving Jonas as the sole beneficiary for the Peyseur family. Jonas Peyseur was said to have furthered the family fortune, investing in or founding the companies of the United Fruit Company, the Mining Equipment Company, Aluminum Company of America, also known as Alcoa, and from these ventures, Jonas Payseur became the leading supplier of both gold and silver for the government. We're told Jonas founded the first meat processing company in America, known as Armour & Company, and proceeded to find hundreds of cattle stockyards across America, which he built along the railway yards. Years before the Civil War, we're told the Peyseurs proceeded to purchase as many southern companies as possible, gathering vast amounts of land in the process. According to this narrative, this myth, Northerners could not keep their businesses afloat or compete with the businesses of the South, and we're told in this theory that was one of the contributing factors to the outbreak of the Civil War. It was, in part, to destroy the Peyseurs. What makes this theory even more outlandish is the claim that the Peyseur family actually handpicked Abraham Lincoln from their own stock to gain the presidency, which apparently was one of the Peyseur stipulations for helping to end the war. The theater that followed was simply that. We're told the Civil War then was nearly every major Southern public record being destroyed or confiscated, as the target of the war was for these properties to eventually be seized by the government, according to this theory. Now, the surviving records in this legend were taken to Bradford, North Carolina, where they were studied, scrutinized, and in some instances entirely rewritten before being returned after the war to their respective cities, if these cities still existed. This is why, again, according to this myth, many ancient American records before the year 1850 appear in the same or very similar handwriting, even across hundreds of miles of southern states. Diving back into the myth of the Peyseur family, we're told that Jonas Payseur created the concept of concealing family interests from the government record by using marriages. Thus, the companies would be in father-in-law or sister-in-law's names, for example, then formed into corporations, and Jonas would then hold stock certificate number 1, being a Class A type preferred stock, signifying prime vote and ownership. The names or surnames said to be under the larger Peyseur family around the time of the Civil War include Smith, Giles, Moore, Poor, Hawkins, Boone, Basson, Bison, Hudson, Kaiser, Reed, as well as Springs and Bashore. The last two names become very significant as we dive further into this mysterious narrative. Jonas Payseur married Harriet Smith, and their eldest son was Louis Cass Payseur. Louis Cass Payseur is listed as the postmaster of North Carolina from 1877 through 1883, meaning for the better part of this time, he had access to everything that was being mailed. Louis invested or bought stock in numerous governmental companies, including the United States Postal Service, the Federal Reserve, the United States Military Railroad Security Police of the Selma, Rome, and Dalton Railroad, known today after many changes and years of obscurity as the CIA. We're also told that during the Depression of the late 1800s, many railroads needed a bailout, which was resolved when Louis Cass Payseur lent them money. However, it appears Louis Cass Payseur knew that they would default on their loans, and when their stocks were all forfeited to Payseur, he amalgamated the companies into one company, known as the Southern Railway Company. Again, we look at the true history, and the Southern Railway Company did in fact exist. It was created from a merger of many companies in the late 1800s, and we're told the history of the companies merged can be traced back over 100 years prior to the merger. We're also told the initial company was formed in 1827 with the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company, which, you guessed it, is right along the same city established as the home for the Peyseur narrative. This could all still be true. We're told in this hypothesis, this narrative, this myth, that the Peyseur family and the railroads acquired the monopoly for the manufacturing of electrical power, being the first to utilize the electric grid and form electric trolleys. The monopoly for these pipeline companies for water and fuels now eventually formed into Standard Oil or Exxon Oil when it was found out that oil could be more profitable. Exporting and importing of goods and foods was controlled by the Peyseurs through their ownership of the canals and railways, as well as lending heavily to the structure of the banking in America. We're told Louis Payseur left no male heirs. At the time of his passing, we have a list entitled, quote, Assets of Louis Payseur, as recorded in book 665, page 20. However, I have yet to figure out what book this is from. Could this be from the 1940 article we mentioned earlier? I do not know, but take everything with a grain of salt. In these assets, which Payseur owned or contributed to, we have nearly every major company in America. I'm going to list them all for you right now. Let's begin. And again, I just remind you that this is all going to be taken with a grain of salt, but these are all the companies that the Payseur family around the turn of the century was said to be involved in. In railroad and related companies, we have the Lancaster and Chester Railroad, the Charlotte, Columbia, and Augusta Railway, the Seaboard Airline Railway, the Chattanooga, Augusta, and Charleston Airline Railway, the Memphis, Charleston Railway, the Port Royal Railway, the Charlotte and Rutherfordton Railway of Lincolnton, the Buffalo, Union, and Carlisle Railway, the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, Nashville and Decatur Railroad, the Great Southern Railroad Line, North and South Alabama Railroad, Mobile and Montgomery Railroad, Georgia Pacific and Louisville, Kentucky Railroad, Pennsylvania Railroad, Mexican Railway, Mexico City, Mexico, Mexican Central Railway, New York Central Railroad, South Pacific Railroad, Missouri Pacific Railroad, Mobile and Ohio Railroad, Charleston, Cincinnati, and Chicago Railroad Company, which somehow is involved with the Federal Reserve, the narrow gauge Camden, Lancaster, Charlotte, all in North Carolina, the Georgia Pacific Railroad Company, the Pullman Company, builders of Pullman cars, which were used on almost all the railways. According to the original author, those are all of the railroad companies which they could find the Payseur name associated with, but railroads are just the beginning. We're now going to look at the banks and related companies associated with the Payseur family, beginning with the Bank of Lancaster, Lancaster, South Carolina, First Bank and Trust Company of Lancaster, South Carolina, the Lancaster Building and Loan Association, the Bank of Heath Springs, the Bank of Charleston, the Bank of Kershaw, Kershaw Mercantile and Banking Company, National Loan and Exchange Bank of Columbia, First National Bank of Camden, National Exchange Bank of Chester, Morgan Guaranty Trust Company of New York, New York Trust Company, the Bank of Richmond, National Loan and Exchange Bank of Camden, Raleigh Savings Bank, American Trust and Savings Bank, Birmingham Trust and Savings Bank, Chase National Bank, Riggs National Bank, Hanover National Bank, Brandywine Bank, South Carolina National Bank, Hamilton National Bank, Jefferson Savings and Loan Association, Bank of South Carolina, Bank of New York, Bank of Macon, Georgia, Pennsylvania National Bank, and finally, Painesville, Ohio Bank. And you hear all of those railroads and you hear all of those banks and you think, wow, that is incredible. If the author was actually able to find the Payseur family and all of those records, that would be almost miraculous. It would be so telling to what the real history really was. But it does not end there, because we also have cotton mills, beginning with the Lancaster Cotton Mill, now known as Spring Mills of Lancaster, South Carolina. We also have the Eureka Cotton Mill, the Springsteen Cotton Mill, and remember that name, it becomes important later. We also have the Dan River Cotton Mill, the LaRave Cotton Mill, the Belton Cotton Mill, the Lancaster Cotton and Oil Company, and the N.K. Fairbank Company, which produced cotton oil in Chicago. But it does not end there. The Payseurs were also said to have their names listed on multiple thread and sewing machine companies, which at this time were cutting edge, beginning with the Singer Manufacturing Company of New York, the New Home Sewing Machine Company of New York, the Hartford Sewing Machine Company, the Rennington Sewing Machine Company, the Domestic Sewing Machine Company, the Clark's O&T Cotton Thread Company, the Corticelli Silk Thread Company, the Fair and Long Clothers of Charlotte, North Carolina. We also have the J.P. Coates Thread Company, the Willimantic Thread Company, and the Willimantic Linen Company, as well as the Chicago Kenosha Hosiery Company and E.C. Stawn and Company. But that is not all. That is just some clothing. We also find the Payseur name, at least according to this narrative, on multiple electric and power companies, including the Southern Power Company, the Duke Power Company, the Lancaster Light and Power Company, the Potomac Electric Company, and General Electric. We also find the Payseur name on multiple gold and silver companies, including Reed Gold Mine, Gastonia Gold Mine, Gold Hill Mining Company, Kings Mountain Gold Mine, Clyde Oro Mining Company, Union Silver Company, Lotawana Silver Mining Company. And in these companies, the Payseurs were supplying nearly all of the gold for the Federal Reserve, at least according to this narrative and the research of this author. Now, we also have multiple iron and steel companies that have the Payseurs listed as one of the investors or owners of stock in the company. These iron and steel companies included the Lincoln Iron Company, formerly Lincolnton Tin Mine and Smelter, now Carnegie Steel. Also included the Woodward Iron Company, Ingalls Steel Company, which included the Ingalls Iron Works Company of Birmingham, Alabama, and the Carnegie Steel Company, as well as the Aluminum Company of America, also known as Alcoa. The Payseurs can also be found with their names in multiple motor vehicle companies, including American Motors Company, General Motors Corporation, Cadillac Motor Car Company, Carolina Cadillac Company, Studebaker Carriages and Wagons Company. Now, if that is not enough for you, because we're showing that they have, or at least at one point, according to this narrative, to this myth, to this legend, have within their stocks that they own, the options that they own, and of these options, they are some of the earliest stockholders in these companies. We even have insurance companies, including Home Insurance Company of 119 Broadway, New York, from Orneville and Selma, Alabama, allegedly the parent to all insurance companies, as well as Mutual Life Insurance Company of New York, Old American Insurance Company of Kansas City, Williams and Gregory Insurance Company of Lancaster, South Carolina. And then we're looking at tobacco and related companies where we can find the Payseurs name. And we have more companies listed here. Have you ever heard of R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, George W. Helm and Company, American Tobacco Company, and Regalia de la Francie Cigar Company? But that is not all, because if you have all of these things in your lifestyle of the industrial age, you might need a watch. And we're told that the Payseurs owned stock in multiple watch companies, including the Elgin National Watch Company, or the National Elgin Watch Company, the Illinois Springfield Watch Company, the American Watch Company, and the Centennial Watch Company, as well as Waterbury Watch Company. But we also have investments by the Payseurs in land and real estate, including Alabama Mineral Land Company of New York, Woodgen Plantation, Botterant Plantation, T.M. Hughes Real Estate Agency, and then we're looking at food and other household goods where you can find the Payseurs as investors, and we're looking at the Gale Bourdon Eagle Milk Company, the Genesee Pure Food Company, General Foods, Heinz Pickle Company, the American Cereal Company, Quaker Oats, the United Fruit Trading Company, Armour & Company, formerly Armour Meatpacking Company, the Lancaster Hardware Company, Mimaw's Department Store, Bibb Stove and Range Company, Swift & Company, the Woolson Spice Company, Cleveland's Baking Powder Company, White Mountain Ice Cream Company, Arbuckle Brothers Coffee Company, King's Buckwheat Flour Company, Lustro Cleaners Company. The Payseur name is also said to be found on the records of the Lincolnton Pharmacy Company, which became Rexall, and the Fleming Brothers Cologne Company, as well as the New Hay Sachet Colgate and Company, which was a perfumer, as well as the Boll Brothers Manufacturing Company of Harrisburg, the Torrance Apparent Seltzer Water Company, the Celluloid Eyeglass Company, the Steel and Price Manufacturing Company, the Brown's Iron Biters Company, the Richmond Heater Company, the Charles W.S. Banks Furniture Company, the Pelube and Company, the Yvette Magnesia Company, Boston Rubber Shoe Company, Sears, Roebuck and Company, as well as Colt, Standard Oil, Exxon, B.F. Goodrich, and Sherman-Williams Paint. We also have the Fort Mill Manufacturing Company, Catawba Fertilizer Company, Lancaster Manufacturing Company, Western Union Telegraph Company, Ashley Phosphate Fertilizer Company, Steamship British Manhattan, Lancaster Mercantile Company, the Pearl Powder, H.S. Robinson and Company, Walter A. Company, and Knapp and Company of Greater New York. We also have Scott and Bow Manufacturing of New York, Rethanol of New York, J. Lichtenstein and Son of New York, Bimble Brothers Stores of New York, Rochester Photo Presses of Rochester, New York, Newman and Company of Buffalo, I.C. Hood and Company, E.W. Hoyt and Company, Dr. J.C. Bayer and Company, the originators of the Bayer aspirin, Hill and Green Company, Ed V. Price Company, W.B. Clapp Young and Company, Hearst Purnell and Company, the National Twist Drill and Tools Company, the Millheisers Manufacturing Company, Joseph Emanuel and Company, the Silverin Company Oneida Silver, J.P. Stevens and Brothers Paper Mill, the Hamilton Company of Canada, and the Quebec and Company of Spain. So my goal here is to dive into this a little bit further, because what I just read to you was a great myth. It was a legend. It was what appears to be a fabrication that has some sort of basis in reality. But I wanted to pull out the reality and find out what we can actually look at and see if this Peyseur family was truly this dominating figure of the old world. One thing is for sure, the Peyseur family, for whatever reason, even while being named in the Wikipedia pages for some of these specific companies and organizations that I just mentioned, none of the Peyseurs have any Wikipedia pages, and it appears more likely that the information about them has actually been scrubbed from most parts of the internet. This is not to say that they didn't exist. We know for a fact that every member of the Peyseur family that I mentioned today did in fact exist. We know for multiple centuries the Peyseurs resided in the Carolinas. Now, I decided to do a little digging into the verified ancestry of the Peyseur family, and what I found was quite remarkable. Let's begin with Daniel Peyseur, whose true identity was said in this great theory that we heard to be Louis the 17th of France. Now, Daniel Peyseur did exist. He lived in Lincoln County, North Carolina, and he passed away in 1861, which just so happened to be the same year as the outbreak of the Civil War. He is buried in Gaston County, North Carolina, under his other known aliases. We have the name Daniel Peyseur, an alternate spelling of his name, but that is the spelling that actually appears on his tombstone. But we also have listed under his other known aliases is the moniker of Adopted Daniel. According to court records, Daniel Peyseur was adopted. Now, this ancestry also lists his parents or his adopted parents as George Hetzer Peyseur II and Hannah Brooks Peyseur. The ancestry of George Peyseur is also well known. According to records, he was born in Maryland, British colony, in 1764 and lived until 1851. Passing and being buried also in Gaston, North Carolina. While no immense biography is given, we're told George Peyseur II was also known as George Pastor or George Bashor, being two different interpretations of his surname. The latter being another name that was used by the Peyseurs in the narrative we read earlier, the myth, when purchasing company stocks in the 19th century. Remarkably, we also have information of George Peyseur II's father, who was known as Johann George Bashor I. His last name was alternately spelled Peyseur, Bezour, Busnar, Boschner, Pasor, or Bashor, and he was born just up the road from me in Lebanon County, Pennsylvania in the year 1720, living for 98 years before passing also in Gaston County, North Carolina in 1818. We even have information about George Bashor I's father, who was Johann George Payseur Jr., born in June of 1694 in Rhineland, Germany, before immigrating to Leacock Township, Pennsylvania. His father, Johann George Payseur Sr., was also born in Rhineland, Germany, living from 1647 through 1719, passing away in Kingston, New York. Johann Sr.'s father was Hans Albrecht, who was born in 1621 in Zweibrücken, Germany, and lived his entire life there until 1680. The bloodline of the family of the Peyseurs seems to begin with Johann Jacob Boschar, who was born in Brettenbach, Germany in 1590. Any record of the family before this time period is missing. Now, a name that repeatedly comes up involving the businesses of the Peyseurs in this myth and legend about them from the 19th century is the name Leroy Springs. Again, all of these myths regarding the Peyseurs all involve real people who existed. Leroy Springs, who is a real person, also has zero Wikipedia page or any information regarding him on there, and he appears to have zero modern credit given to his name, and yet he repeatedly is mentioned as a founder or lead financer of multiple companies throughout North and South Carolina, mainly in Lincolnton and Lancaster. According to his mainstream narrative on the South Carolina Historic Center, and I quote, in 1928, towards the end of his career, Leroy Springs was president of 7 cotton mill companies, president of the Bank of Lancaster, the Lancaster and Chester Railway, the Lansford Water and Power Company of Lancaster, vice president of the Bank of Kershaw, director of the Catawba Fertilizer Company, the Lancaster Cotton Oil Company, First National Bank of Camden, National Exchange Bank of Kershaw, Savings Bank of Fort Mill, the Southern Home Fire Insurance Company of Charleston, the Prudential Fire Insurance Company of Greenville, trustee of the Mutual Life Insurance Company of New York, and director of the American Trust Company, as well as vice president of the Columbia, South Carolina National Bank. He was a director of the Charleston, Columbia, and Augusta Railway at the time that it merged with the Southern Railway to become the largest in America. He was probably officially connected with more separate corporations than any other businessman in the history of South Carolina. End quote. His businesses even continue to function in some capacity today as the Leroy Springs Company. However, the only Wikipedia page that is dedicated to anything that has to do with him is the page for the Leroy Springs House in Lancaster, South Carolina, which serves as the City Hall of Lancaster and was built in the 1830s before being improved by Leroy later in the 19th century. His second wife, Lena Jones Wade Springs, was the first woman in history to be nominated for the Vice President of the United States, which occurred at the 1924 Democratic Convention. The Wikipedia website makes no direct mention of Leroy Springs, even though countless organizations, companies, and foundations which still exist were founded by him. If you can't tell, there's already something afoot. When you visit the website Payseurs.com, which appears to be a farce or parody, you'll find almost instantaneously available information regarding the cover-up of the Peyseurs' history, which is all the more remarkable as this apparent farce website has been functioning for a long time, distributing information that is currently labeled to be myth, legend, or simply untrue. It seems we may be peeling back the veil after all. Now again, this is all conjecture and myth, but it is proposed that Springs of Leroy Springs fame originated as a Jewish family name of Springsteen when they migrated to America in the early 1700s. It says that they were a banking family along the lines of the Rothschilds. Now, this is the theory, the hypothesis from the earlier book. The author goes into detail saying that the Springsteens were brought to install banking into America, and they changed their name to Springs and worked their way into finance beginning in New York before being hired, but some would say recommended to the Payseur family from the Rothschilds. Now, this is where we get into a little bit of the gray area, but the Springs, being from a young age trained to be the face of the companies, the Peyseur family companies. In this capacity, we're told Leroy Springs ran a vast majority of the largest operations for the Peyseur family, and in confirmed genealogy, Leroy Springs' father was one man known by A. Springs. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. According to the legend or the theory, which again, this is all unsubstantiated, but Nancy Hanks, prominent member of the McCadden Scottish family and the mother of Abraham Lincoln, when she traveled to Lincolnton, North Carolina to visit her family, this is where she met A. Springs, and his family owned a large estate in that area. Here, according to this legend, they began a love affair, which ended in the birthing of a son. Apparently, this son was destined to be the face of America by the Payseur family. The child was given the name Abraham in reference to the Abrahamic religions, and the last name of Lincoln was given as a tongue-in-cheek reference or symbolism to the location where the child was conceived. In Lincoln's own words, and I quote, "Owing to my father being left an orphan at the age of 6 years in poverty and in a new country, he became a wholly uneducated man, which I suppose is the reason why I know so little of my family history." End quote. Again, we see the plausible deniability at work. Furthermore, seemingly lending a little bit of credence to this myth is that the real historical figure of A. Springs, who is the known father of Leroy Springs, and Leroy being a real figure who was a businessman with ties to the real businessman Jonas Payseur, it only adds fuel to the fire when we learn that A. Springs, in his last will and testament, left his fortune and lands to his children, including a massive tract of land in Alabama, which would become the city of Huntsville, Alabama, which today is the largest city in Alabama. The entirety of Huntsville was left in the will of A. Springs to his son, listed under the name of Abraham Lincoln. The question then becomes, was this the President Abraham Lincoln? And if so, why is he being listed on the will and testament of A. Springs? Further adding to the mystery of Lincoln, in 2010, historians discovered 4 muster rolls, registers of troops in military units, among the possessions of James Reed, a Donner Party pioneer. Remember earlier how the Reeds are tied to the Peyseurs? The Illinois businessman Reed was kicked out of the expedition after attacking a fellow traveler, but Reed's wife stayed with the convoy, carrying these papers the whole way to California. Over 100 years later, researchers looking over the rolls noticed Abraham Lincoln's name listed alongside Reed's, as the two men were apparently good friends who served together in the Black Hawk War. Apparently, Lincoln had contemplated traveling with the Donner Party to California, but later changed his mind at the last minute. Finally, the last thing I would like to talk about, even though there are countless other theories discussed within these articles about the hidden history of the Peyseur family, we should look at the true origin of Lincoln's ancestry, and further focus should play on the people of Appalachia, specifically a group known as Melungeon. Definitions of who Melungeon people are differs because it is not a specifically defined group. Historians and genealogists have tried to identify surnames of different families that identify as Melungeon, and in 1943, Virginia State Register of Vital Statistics leader Walter Ashby Plecker identified the surnames as Collins, Gibson, Moore, Poor, Goins, Ramsey, Delph, Freeman, Barlow, Bolin, Mullins, and Hawkins. Many of these same surnames that are associated with this group are also associated with the Peyseurs. We're told the Melungeons have close ties to the Creole people, the Turks of the Carolinas, which I've never heard of, and the Chester Ridge people, although most of the Melungeons noted their ancestors had resided in the hills of Appalachia for thousands of years. In recent years, it has been argued that there is a possibility, let's call it a theory, that Lincoln has ties to the Melungeon stock, and Abraham Lincoln, by this theory, not only could have been related to the Peyseurs on his father's side, but also part of an often criticized and ostracized and written out of history group of early Americans in Appalachia whose history has been erased, but they have African ancestry. As you can see throughout the video today, the one purpose was to entertain all of the wild theories that appear to be the same theories that, for whatever reason, we are not supposed to be discussing. Now, when we get into the Peyseur family, what we've proven today is that every member of this Peyseur narrative did in fact exist. What they did, we cannot exactly put our fingers on, but there's a lot more here than meets the eye. Now, the last thing I wanted to share with you, which I felt was a great way to wrap up this video, is actually an article written by Louis Cass Payseur in 1915, and it is in regards to what he saw as a young boy during the Civil War. So this is absolutely fascinating. Again, just proving the Peyseur family did exist. In what capacity did they have power in America? I will let you decide. Love to hear about it down below, and I will talk to you all about this more on the next video.